Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Well, folks, I want to welcome a very special guest onto today's podcast, and this another one of our segments of the Gospel at Work segments. I'm trying to sort of marry together a Gospel at Work segment with a curating your book library segment. And to do that, I'm just delighted to have as my very special guest, Mr. Robert Wolgemuth. Welcome, sir.
Hello, RC. Great to hear your voice and see your face, man.
Well, I do have the room a little dark, so
That's okay. I can see you just fine.
Okay. Well, Robert, you and I have been friends for a long, long time, and I want folks to know a little bit about your background. I'll start with what I know. My first introduction to Robert was in a restaurant. I remember it was a booth, and I was there listening in on a conversation with Robert and Mike Hyatt and my father about their early plans for what became the New Geneva Study Bible.
Exactly right.
Yep, and Robert was leading, or I think at that time you were still at Nelson, and then not long after that,
Actually, we had our own publishing company then.
Open up Wolgemuth and Hyatt.
That's it. Yes. Or like your daddy used to say, Hyatt and Wolgemuth.
Yeah.
just a kid, just to push me around.
Yes. And so you served in that role, running that organization for around 10 years. Is that right?
Right. Pretty close.
And then went into the literary representation business, represented my father for a long, long time. And in addition to that, you've also written about 20 books, and we're here today to talk about your latest one. You've also just been a very dear friend to me and to Lisa, as your delightful wife as well, whose taping you missed for the first time very recently. I saw that on Facebook.
Did you? Yeah, that's right. Yes, I was called out of town and I wasn't able to be there. So I FaceTimed the opening prayer. She held up her phone and I prayed. I don't know if you saw that. We miss Lisa. It's been so fun to have Lisa come and be a part of those recordings.
Yes, I'm sorry she wasn't able to be there. Right now, one of the things on our plate is we're also caring for some grandchildren during the day, and that's been a lot of fun, but it does limit opportunities.
You bet. I get that part for sure.
Yes. Well, you may not know this, but this first segment that I mentioned, the Gospel at Work, I've been talking to different people in different jobs. I've talked to a Christian school teacher and a public school teacher. I spoke to a small businessman. I've spoken to some pastors, some professors, and my goal for this segment is to ask people to describe for me how their experience of the gospel impacts their interaction with the people that they deal with in their work. It's not necessarily, I don't want to exclude it, but it's not focused specifically on how do I present the gospel to people. It's more, how does my thinking about my redemption impact how I interact with people? And I know you've interacted with people. I'm guessing, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm guessing, given the close relationships that you've had with folks over the years, that you've had to deal with even situations like my own with scandal in people's lives, and how does you've worked with some of the biggest names in Big Eva. And
Big Eva, capital Eva.
Yes. How does the gospel just drive you in what you're doing?
Wow. Um, boy, I could take this so many places. I'm going to start with what the gospel says about who I am.
Uh-huh.
I grew up in a home. I'm so grateful for my parents now in heaven. We grew up in a tradition, RC, that was very, very works driven.
Okay.
Um, the Mennonites are amazing people. They're hardworking people. But as I was growing up, people got points for the fact they had a black car, that men had beards but no mustaches because mustaches were worldly. Women wore only dresses and navy if they got really wild and crazy, or gray if they went crazy. Um, Incredibly focused on how things looked rather than how things were. And so this has haunted me. It continues to, that the grace that belongs to me by virtue of the cross and the righteousness that's thrown over me, not by my own choosing, frees me up to not worry about stuff like that.
Right.
You know, so it's actually, this was one of the things that inspired me to write this book, because I found myself, as I was getting older, as I am getting older, I'm at 73 now, that in the night, I started to speak to myself. I started to hear voices. Now, I know this sounds like Sybil or a movie or something like that. I don't mean that. So, as you know, guys at our age get up once or twice in the night because we have to. So you go back to bed. Your wife is lying there, sound asleep. You married a younger woman like I did, and so as you're lying there, you begin to review the day before. You begin to look at the things that you have to do in the next day. You review phone calls, conflicts, struggles, failures, and I know you love Martin Lloyd-Jones. I found something that he wrote years and years ago, warning men about not listening to themselves,
Uh-huh.
not listening to those voices, but speaking to yourself. And so you lie there and you say, you know what? I don't know who's reminding me of all this stuff. It could be Satan, it could be last night's pizza, but I'm not going to let those voices control me. The gospel says that I am righteous before Christ because of the blood and the resurrection. And I'm going to speak back to that voice and say, no, you're not going to get me there. I'm not going to feel like a failure and a fool, because Jesus died for me. He considered me worthy enough for his blood to be shed. So it's interesting. So, I mean, asking the question that you just asked is incredibly personal. And it's not just sharing your faith, which I love to do, and I talk about that in the book, but it starts with who I believe that I am before Christ. In fact, years and years ago, there was a book written by Bruce Larson, who actually became the pastor of a big church in Seattle. And he wrote a book called No Longer Strangers. And he says this very thing. He says, so we are quicker to forgive others when they wrong us than we are to forgive ourselves when we've sinned. And he said, that is pure pride. I never forget where I was when I read that. But that's what I'm talking about. That I deserve condemnation, but because of Christ, because of what he did for me, I'm as free as the guy I'm forgiving who did something stupid to me. And that has been so freeing. That is the gospel with skin on. And it's been a great experience for me to realize that for my own life.
And something that you're zealous to spread out. Again, it does show up in this book. I don't want to push anybody under the bus, but as you were talking about those Mennonite roots, I was drawn back to your description of your grandfather, and you had very kind and respectful things to say about him, but you also pointed out that he wasn't the most chipper fella in the
Yeah,
world.
yeah. Whatever else you say today, that's the understatement. So I talk at the beginning of the book about, as a man, uh, you meet older guys, and they're probably your dad or your grandfather. So because we shared DNA, as I've gotten older, I've watched how I have replicated their lives. And so what I do is I review. I talk about culling lumber at the Home Depot or Lowe's. You go through the stack. The clerk hates you, but you get permission before you do this, and you put all the crooked ones back on the stack and keep the straight ones and put them in your cart.
Uh-huh.
So you look back and you say, okay, what from those three men, my two grandfathers and my father, is worth putting on my cart, and what can I put back by the grace of God back on the stack and not let it control me? And that's been a hugely freeing thing for me. I've loved that experience of identifying that, making a metaphor out of it that I understand, and getting on with enjoying and celebrating and being grateful for the things that those three men taught me and showed me.
Well, that reminds me, Robert. I want to talk a little bit about my experience reading the book, and something that you probably know, and I should give you the credit to know, but just in case you don't, I want you to hear this. There is and this I'm sure you know, there's a formula out there for writing books where you lead your chapter with a story, an anecdote, and then you sort of unpack the lesson from the anecdote, and somewhere in there you put your Bible verse, and
Yeah, and you quote C.S. Lewis.
yeah,
Got to do that.
right.
Yeah,
And
that's
then you
right.
have your little
Oh, yeah.
application section at the end, and so and people find those stories to be engaging, which is why we put them in there. But I think we miss what's engaging. I don't
Okay.
think it's the fact that it's a story. I think it's the fact that it's you, that it's the
Oh,
person. And as I'm reading Gunlap, of course, I have the blessing of knowing you, but as I'm reading Gunlap, I'm just really taken with uh, the fact that I'm hearing you talk. I'm.
oh,
It's not maudlin, but there's a manifestation of the old Red Smith line: "Writing is easy; you just open a vein and bleed." I mean, there
it's
was,
easy.
yeah. Uh, I mean, there's genuine honesty, and I think that too is a big gospel thing. That when you know you're covered,
Yeah,
there's no reason to cover.
I love it. Yeah,
Yeah, and so
yeah,
there's
yeah.
an openness and an honesty in the book. Let me just and well, let me confess this. Well, now that I've taught you something about writing, let me teach you something about giving a book to a title, or a title to a book. I had no idea what Gunlap was, and when I learned from reading, I loved it, and that was very much what I tend to do. But I have experts, agents, publishers, always telling me, be straightforward, be clear, don't be poetic, don't be esoteric. But you did, and I just loved it. I love the title. But I'm going to ask you to open it up for our listeners. What does Gunlap mean?
I was introduced to the concept, RC, when I was a senior in college. I'd finished my classes and tests, and the athletic director said, "We're hosting the conference track meet." And I went to Taylor, just a few hours from where I am right now in north central Indiana. And so uh, I had the opportunity to rake the landing pit for the pole vault and the high jump. And I didn't do any of the timing because that takes an expert. So the 2 mile race is next. And over the previous year, I had witnessed this young man, a sophomore at Taylor, running the wee hours of the morning, like 3 o'clock in the morning. I was finishing my day. He was starting his day.
Uh-huh.
Do I need to say any more? A kid named Ralph Foote, who, by the way, I got to meet for the first time when I was Actually, when I was finished with this book, I got his permission to write about him, but I got
Huh.
to meet him, which was so cool. So he ran the 2 mile around a quarter-mile track, which is 8 times around.
Right.
So when the race begins, the starter puts his arm in the air and fires a pistol. That the race has begun. When the lead runner, in this case Ralph Budd, began the final lap, the starter does the same thing, puts his arm in the air and fires the gun. And that signals the final lap, the gun lap. So I remembered that and said, that's a perfect metaphor. This is not about dying. This isn't even about the finish line. This is about running the final lap, the gun lap. That's where it came from.
Yeah. It brings to mind not only that powerful image, but it brings to mind probably the most powerful story I ever heard my father tell, which I'm sure you probably remember. And it was the story, when I first heard it, I was probably a teenager, and it was really the most vulnerable I ever saw him. He was the story of his own father's death.
Wow.
And his father died when my father was 17. He had a series of strokes and was in bad shape for quite some time. And on this particular day, he was in his sick bed, and he was with my dad, and he said to my dad, I have finished the race. I've kept the faith. And my dad said to him, don't say that.
Wow.
Yeah. This is more to the end than your book is, but it is looking back at this last part of his life, and he's acknowledging that God has been faithful to him and that he's been able to finish the race. And my dad, of course, unwilling, unable to accept this end, instead of praising his father and encouraging his father and affirming his father,
Wow.
says don't. And the guilt of that just stayed with him enough that it was a very powerful story for him to tell me some 25 years after the fact, when I first heard it. Now, I had the privilege, when he died, of being able to tell him that he had run the race and he had kept the faith.
And he didn't tell you not to say that.
That's right.
Yeah, I love it. I
Yeah.
love it. Well, as you know, and as people who are watching and listening to you right now, I loved your daddy more than I could ever describe. So you have an amazing legacy.
I do, and he shows up in the book as well.
He does. He does.
There's so many things I wanted to make sure that we get covered. Tell me, or tell our listeners, how you approach the question, because it in some ways it reminded me of one of my earlier books called Almighty Over All, where I sort of took a slice of reality and asked, well, how does God's sovereignty direct this? And then the next chapter is His sovereignty in that. And your gun lap sort of covers the bases of different kinds of endings. Tell us about how you chose those things, what you wanted to cover.
Well, as you know, I've been in the publishing business for 40 years. Excuse me. And I have probably published 1,000 books. I've been involved in the publishing of probably 1,000 books. And so I've been in lots of marketing meetings, lots of meetings. The question is, what is this book about? Number one. Two, who's it for?
Mm-hmm.
And so the answer for this book is, what's this book about? It's about running the last lap of your life. The question about who it's for, it's for me. I wrote a book for myself. I really did. And it's interesting, I mentioned Tim LaHaye early in the book, who told me, and I've retold this hundreds of times, a book is a long letter to one person.
Mm-hmm.
Because people read a book one at a time. So when you read a book and it says, the author says, most of you want to go, no, 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 not most of you. Turn the microphone off, get off the platform,
Uh-huh.
pour a cup of coffee. This is a conversation, you and one other person. So I wrote this book selfishly for myself.
Uh-huh.
I wanted to hear this message. I wanted to be encouraged by this message. And so in the providence of God, I had the joy of interviewing my three brothers who in their own wonderful, distinct ways are doing a wonderful job of running this last lap.
Uh-huh.
So that gave me an excuse to sit down with them. My youngest brother is just finishing a 16-year tenure as the president of Youth for Christ. A role my daddy had many years ago. My dad was the 5th president. My brother's the 9th president. And he's just finished his term, and he's done.
Uh-huh.
He texted me today and said, this is the first time I've not been to the high-level meetings that I used to chair. They're having the meeting without me.
Uh-huh.
They're talking about a 5-year strategy. I'm not part of it. So this is a big deal for him. And this book, again, in the sovereignty and the kindness of the Lord, I wrote this book, not just for myself, but as it turned out, for my little brother, who's 66 years old and is right now facing his gun lab, running his gun lab. So it's been an amazing experience because my good friends, many of them, my brothers, my friends, are dealing with this season of their lives right now. Some are doing well, some aren't. In fact, there's a man in my business whose name you go.
Excuse me.
That's okay.
Unfortunately, I have this off, but it comes through on the
yeah, there you go.
computer.
That's okay. That's okay. Not long ago, I was in a conversation with a man whose name you may know. I'm not going to repeat it, of course, who is a year older than me. I've known him for 35 years. And I hadn't heard from him for a while. I knew that he had retired, but I hadn't heard from him. So I called him. And he said, he sounded terrible. He said, when I woke up this morning, I laid there in bed and thought to myself, I would rather be dead.
Oh.
This is an accomplished, brilliant, seminary-trained man. And he's in his gun lap and doesn't know what to do with himself. This is the very guy I'm writing this book for. This is not funny. You know, I tell a story about going out with college friends. You get your 50th and they give you funny stuff and, you know, whatever, hemorrhoid cream.
Right.
Everybody laughs. Then you get your 60th birthday and, you know, maybe one more party, depends maybe, but no party for the 70th because there's nothing funny about it. So my job actually is to lift the weight a little bit, to insert some fun and humor, anecdotes, stories, but also to understand, to recognize this is a really serious thing. I talk about the conversation with my daddy, who was probably 85. And I said, Dad, how do you feel? And he said, I feel useless. I'm writing a book to a man who's entering this, who doesn't have the ability to do what he used to do. You know, I walk into a room, I turn around 3 times, I walk back out because I have no idea why I walked into that room. I forget names. I forget facts. I'm not happy about this. So what am I going to do? I'm going to make peace with it. I'm going to realize that my body's wasting away. The Apostle Paul talks about that very specifically. It's interesting, isn't it? In Isaiah, 41, the prophet talks about soaring, running, and walking. Isn't that an interesting transition from soaring, running, and walking? And that, to me, that's a metaphor for my life.
Uh-huh.
I used to be able to soar. I've got pictures of me building things that you wouldn't believe. That was soaring, and then running, and then now walking. I'm grateful to be able to walk.
Mm-hmm.
So, and actually being diagnosed with cancer 15 months ago was also kind of a wake-up call that I wanted to write a book to myself. I wanted to be able to chronicle the things that I was feeling and experiencing, not just so people would feel sorry for me, but to be an encouragement to men who understand this, who identify with it, who say, that's me right now. What can you do to encourage me? That's why I wrote this book.
Well, and it does show through. And just like the point is not the story, the point is that it's you in the story. In the same way, when you are talking to yourself, when you're hearing those voices, when you're realizing what you need to hear,
yeah,
that's how you know what your audience needs to hear.
That's right.
This is just the literary version of preaching to yourself.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you know what? You may be aware of this, and I know that you and Lisa know Nancy, but when I was diagnosed with cancer, she said, all right, we're gonna build a gratitude wall.
Yeah.
So, 1 Thessalonians 5:18, that ought to be tattooed to my arm. Because what I've discovered, because Nancy said, let's get little Post-it notes, write what we are grateful for that particular day, and we're going to slam it on the wall. We had our eating area, you've been in there, with maybe 250 Post-it notes, multicolored, where we wrote things that we were grateful for. So, okay, in fact, I write about running with a limp. Every man I know who's my age has a limp. There's some, and it's physical, or it's emotional, or it's spiritual. And so what do you do with that? What you do is you give thanks.
Yes. Excellent. Well, I am so grateful for the time that you've given us. I'm grateful for this book. It's published by Broadman and Holman. And again, it's called Gun Lap, and I would encourage folks to get it. Do you want me to send them to Amazon? Is there a better place?
Sure. No, that's fine. Perfect.
Okay,
yeah, you
get
bet.
it at Amazon. You can leave a nice review there as well, and check it out. I think I'm going to be bringing this to I go to a weekly men's group on Fridays, and a lot of older men, and I just think this would be a great thing for them to go through. Together, and I would say that to any listeners who might, be a part of a men's group. And by the way, you don't have to be as ancient as Robert to benefit from this. I noticed earlier you said our age as if we were in the same age bracket. I think pretty much any demographic would still separate us. Although tomorrow I move out of past 55 and into 56. So
okay.
I'm getting into the 56 to 64 crowd.
There's a lot of mileage left on those tires, R.C. Sproul. I'm proud of you. So. Let me just say one more thing. My dad was not an expressive person. My maternal grandfather, as I write, was. My paternal grandfather was not. And I have found myself, when I text or email a friend, or in a conversation, I finish with these 3 words: I love you.
And you, Robert. I'm
looking into your face. You and I have a sweet track record of friendship, and I want you to know I love you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I want you to know, not only do I love you, not only does my wife love you, but we really, literally, every single day remember to pray for you and Nancy.
Thank you, R.C. I love you, my friend.
You too. Thanks so much. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.